in the status quo, we believe that refugees are unable to integrate into their society. So even if they receive short-term benefits, they don't actually have any sort of benefits that can allow them to become real citizens of a country. We believe that this policy allows for refugees to shirk off their stateless status and actually contribute to an economy where they are currently living. A couple of points on the model, then 3 points that we want to bring you on opening government. First of all, we are only talking about getting long-term asylum. That is to say that countries would still grant short-term asylum status to refugees without having to give 1 year of military service. Second, when it comes to places that are close to conflict, we think we're talking about countries in a given region. So for example, refugees for the Syria conflict, we're saying that countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey would provide this policy. Finally, recognize that military service is not exclusive to combat roles. That is to say that we're not necessarily throwing refugees into bloody conflicts, we are just incorporating them into the military, which can include non-combatant roles for people who might not have any sort of experience in the field. A couple of reasons why we think this is a good policy. First, we think it's principally just on 2 levels. First, on the individual level. Insofar as refugees are receiving certain benefits associated with long-term asylum status, that is to say, they receive economic benefits for country and also security from the security from the state under which they are seeking asylum, we think that there's an obligation on them to contribute more broadly to national security. Especially speaking, because we think the only way to limit a national obligation to individuals, for example refugees, is by ensuring that they are contributing to a certain way to the security of a country. We think that this policy is especially well suited to do that insofar as they are receiving basically security benefits from that country, so it makes sense for them to contribute in a security fashion. Second of all, we think this is principally just on a more broader national level. Countries and regions where conflicts occur uniquely bear the brunt of that conflict. For example, in response to the Syrian conflict, the flood of refugees coming across the border into Jordan has significantly impacted their economy, leading to a per capita fall in GDP of about 15%. We think that insofar as countries in the region receive harms associated with these conflicts, we think it is justified for them to receive countervailing benefits. That is to say, an increased source of individuals who are contributing to their national defense and contributing to military service. We think especially this is one of the only ways to rectify international inequalities between countries. We think that in the status quo, countries all around the world might share some responsibility in allowing a conflict to continue to occur. We think that in the status quo, other countries in other parts of the world simply aren't going to take responsibility, and this is the only way that countries in the region can lessen the blunt, which we think is justified. Second point of substantive material is that we think this policy is especially beneficial to refugees. First point under this is that it provides a positive route for integration for refugees. In the status quo, many refugees are essentially confined to refugee camps in the long term, especially in countries in the developing world where these conflict zones are likely to occur, where there aren't actual mechanisms for integration into broader society. We think that this is really, really bad insofar as it means that individuals languish in these camps without any sort of real route to economic opportunity and to integration within broader society. That means that they are uniquely likely to fall prey to things like sex and drug trafficking or radical extremism, which means that they are cast into other violent conflicts and are more likely to die or more likely to be targeted by the security forces in this individual country. We think on our side of the house, when they are essentially going into military service, they are more likely to be integrated for a couple of reasons. A, they get increased job security. B, they probably are going to get paid to a certain extent because most people who participate in national militias get a source of income. C, they're likely to become more likely to learn the national language and things like that. And finally, they'll make contacts within the government and within the country that will allow them to essentially have some sort of people whom they can rely upon once they get out of military service. We think that's comparatively better than the status quo when these individuals have no route for actually moving forward. I'll take a POI from closing if they have one.
Okay, so first you tell us that immigrants cost like 15% of the country's GDP. You then tell us that they should spend a year not contributing to that GDP and taking money out of the government coffers through wages. Why is that a good idea?
A couple of arguments. First, in the status quo, they already received those benefits through refugee camps. That's why per capita GDP has fallen by so much. Second, we think that if you essentially allow these refugees to partake in military service, that frees up additional resources for other people in that country to contribute to the broader economic conditions because they don't have to serve in the military. But finally, we think that insofar as not everybody is going to be in a combat role, they can contribute to national growth in other ways. For example, you can be part of the military that does social service projects or disperses aid and things like that, which we think do contribute to growth. Second point under why this is beneficial to refugees is because it reduces anti-refugee sentiment. We think that on our side of the house, there is a broader national belief that refugees actually do contribute positively to a country, insofar as they are literally providing for the security of the country. That is comparatively better than the status quo, when they are often seen as leeches who are not actually doing anything for the the country. We think that means that there is actually reduced like anti-refugee sentiment insofar as they are seen as some people who are not just basically living off the coffers of the state and instead actually doing something to help the country. A couple of benefits here. First of all, we think that directly there's less discrimination against individual refugees. That is to say, when they try to do things like, later down the road start their own business or later down the road try to get a job, they face less individual discrimination, meaning that their own personal lives are better. But moreover, we think that this leads to better refugee policy, because insofar as there are broader pro-refugee sentiments among the general population, it means that there's more likely to be additional humanitarian aid, for example, in conflict zones, or additional funding for refugee camps to make sure the people who are there just in the short term don't languish in poverty and actually do have broader opportunities going forward. The third independent argument that we want to advance is why this is broadly beneficial for the country. First reason why is because we think that in a lot of countries in zones of conflict, the militaries typically aren't super well stocked. That is to say, they don't necessarily have a ton of people whom they can draw upon to get any sort of real security benefits or to put people into a conflict zone in order to tamp down conflicts. We think that on our side of the house, militaries in these regions are more likely to be well staffed, well stocked, and better equipped to actually deal with the conflicts that are happening on their borders. We think that means that they are comparatively more able to do things like improve security conditions in those countries next door and mean that the on-the-ground lives for people in those countries are improved. But second of all, we think this provides a lot of security benefits insofar as it stems the flow of refugees, or stems the flow of undocumented refugees who aren't actually taken into account by the service of the country. In the status quo, governments typically have a very difficult time keeping track of all the refugees that are flowing into their country. Reason being that there is no sort of systematic system for registering refugees, figuring out who they are, and the like. On our side of the house, refugees have an active incentive to basically tell the government who they are in order to receive the benefits not only of military service, but also long-term asylum status that they can be assured of. They're more likely to be additional checks in place to make sure that the governments of these countries know everybody within their country and also are able to keep tabs on people who might pose security harms in the future. Therefore, on our side of the house, not only do we see benefits for refugees, but also for governments in the region. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. Hereby call upon the Leader of the Opposition. Go ahead.
Realistically, OG is talking about the millions of refugees who flee from areas like Syria to countries like Jordan that do take them in and that are integrating them successfully by capitalising on what is refugees' best asset, which is their long-term economic productivity and the sentiment of a country that will take them in because that is a moral obligation and not a transactional payoff that you make it into. This is how we conceive of the problem with refugees. Mostly, the kinds of problems they're talking about are problems with countries like in Europe who aren't taking in refugees for these reasons. This program will make it more likely that you conceive of refugees as owing a country something and will no longer take them in. Secondly, this pushes more of those refugees to countries near conflict zones. We think that is a bad thing for refugees and countries in conflict zones. Thirdly, this will put refugees in the worst possible position in terms of long-term integration, makes it more likely that at best you get temporary settlement, which is the worst thing for refugees, and illegal movement to other countries to avoid military service. Those are all of the worst options for refugees and countries. I'm going to go through this in a couple of issues. No thanks. First, I'm going to deal with the moral issue in terms of the analysis they provided, and then I will say why that moral issue is most owed in a different way. To the first thing. The first thing I want to address here is what the actual problem is in terms of refugee intake. Because the description in terms of people resenting the lack of economic productivity applies more to countries under enormous economic strain that are making that kind of argument in Europe, like Greece, than it does to countries like Jordan, who demand external funding for the enormous refugee intake they see as their obligation, no thank you, from countries where they have a lot of relationships with countries across the border. Secondly, even if this is true, that occurs only at the point of making their integration into society look better, and you having a long-term appreciation of that, which doesn't change an immediate large influx and intake of refugees, which is the actual problem in terms of getting people immediately out of a crisis that you change. Thirdly, at best, that's a reason to provide optional employment, and we would suggest non-military employment that allows you to provide productivity to society, and for instance, is not something that the state pays for. We think those kinds of things, in addition to the fact this is only perceived as a compulsory one-year service, so the perception of how much value you're actually adding is very limited in terms of people that are actually inclined to resent refugees in the way that they talk about. It's very little moral obligation. Secondly, the most objectionable thing from that speech, refugees owe more because of this conflict and the strain that they place on other states. First, we say that who should repay that burden is obviously difficult to figure out. One, people who have undergone a conflict to the extent they are justified in fleeing from that conflict are the least well placed to do that. Two, people in countries in conflict zones, even with limited capacity, that state has more capacity to impact the conflict and has likely had more involvement in the conflict than people fleeing from a state that is most under persecution. We think even where that burden is not ideal in any circumstance, it should not be borne by refugees. Third, there's other capacity to influence this conflict from other states that could provide money, even when you're talking about European countries not want to take in refugees, that could at the very least pay for some resettlement of refugees in Jordan, which we think are the kinds of options countries like Germany will be pursuing and are pursuing. Those kinds of alternatives are a better moral obligation. More reasons why this is unacceptable, and this is in substantive material. Conceiving of asylum as a conditional right is a bad way to perceive of it and means we're more likely to attach conditions, because it endorses the view, which is the view that the Prime Minister explored in the first minute of his speech, that refugees owe something because of the burden they place on a country. That makes it actually very easy for the kinds of countries they're realistically talking about to increasingly inflict conditions. It also makes it more likely that countries who are increasingly moving out of conflict are likely to retain these kinds of conditions for refugees moving in that country, which is important because obviously it's always incredibly difficult in the peak of conflict. This makes it more likely you extend that. Secondly, in substantive, no thank you. You're likely to instead have long-term temporary asylum because people won't want to take this kind of asylum, and you've said the only kind of long-term permanent asylum is based on this condition. So there's more justification for exploring more temporary asylum programs, which are incredibly bad because you have little political stability to do things like demand other things while you're in the country because you could always be deported. That's also especially true for people like women and children or people who don't make good-term long military service or who don't think they would, including in countries like Jordan or Turkey, who can be selective about which people they think would endure that military service, which is also true of non-combat roles. We think that that is also something that they would pursue. Third, we think it's really bad because these people are least well suited to military service. Because if you're an asylum seeker fleeing a conflict zone, you're most likely to have endured conflict, which means that even if you're like a freaking nurse or a peacekeeper or somewhere near the conflict border, you're still likely to undergo more trauma, seeing what is likely people that are from your country undergoing that trauma. And also, this vulnerable population, they say is not respected, will be pushed into the worst roles in that military and puts a whole population up for abuse in the worst elements of conflict this country no longer wants to undergo. Second, what are the actual benefits in terms of refugee intake? Yep.
Many of Syria's neighbours, including all of the Gulf states and Israel, took no refugees from Syria. So is it realistic to expect that countries share your view that there's an unconditional moral obligation to take refugees?
Yeah, no, not everyone thinks it's unconditional. You make it that everyone will make it conditional. Countries like Jordan will put the refugees they do take into military service or long-term unstable intake, which is a worse condition than they're under now, and you make the alternatives much worse. So what are the benefits of refugee intake? I've already dealt with a lot of this. They say this is a route to integration. We say it's unlikely these will be particularly good military service in the way they talk about, and their benefits are conditional on proving that. They'll need immense integration, language training, skills, all of those kinds of things, which are bad to put in the military rather than in jobs where they would get other forms of integration. They're unlikely to get social integration or integration into actual communities in which they would subsequently live in, which makes it much more difficult when you come back from being in the military and also having been a refugee, which makes integration into that country it makes integration incredibly difficult. We think that this comes at the cost of pursuing better long-term policies, which even if they are difficult in terms of shorter intake right now, you at the moment instead lock in a policy of never taking in refugees unless they commit to that, and otherwise only taking them on temporary visas that you're able to expel at the moment there is any increased political instability. So that's the reason you would actually get a removal of large refugee populations. Lastly, in terms of actually helping the country, the only way they see as them really getting long-term stability and appreciation is a bad thing in a conflict zone to say is the only option for people fleeing a conflict zone to be most likely to be put back into that zone. This is the worst solution to the problems that they have misconceived of, and locks in a long-term worse approach to refugees in these countries we're very proud to oppose.
Well, thanks, Speaker for the speech. Hereby call upon Deputy Prime Minister.
It's helpful to explore the realistic alternative for a lot of the refugees that are found in these precarious positions, where the supply is so low for both short-term and long-term asylum, but also that they have no realistic opportunity to integrate into the economies autonomously. That is why on their model, when they say that they can advocate for policies like short-term employment benefits or other things that increase service that are not militaristic, is unrealistic. It is either A, it is provided employment from the state, in which case it is the same drain on resources, except that they are no longer beneficial to the conflict at stake, which is the root cause of the problem, or B, it's provided by the private sector, which is also not an option, because if that were an option in the status quo, they would be finding jobs in droves anyway. The fact that refugees are stranded in many of these camps is a reason as to why our solution is the only way to do that, because a lot of times military service is an internal route to not only monetary assimilation, but cultural and social assimilation as well, i.e., if the real problem is not in actuality the conflict, but rather the perception that these people are free riders, then the easiest way to fix the negative domestic sentiment that they also agree is a bad problem is to make sure that people don't think of refugees as useless, resource-sapping individuals, but rather productive people who can actually contribute to a militaristic conflict. A couple points of rebuttal before I go into the main points of clash on the case. They say that ultimately this is an unconditional moral obligation because having conditions on these types of conditions on asylum makes it such that refugees cannot demand things in the future. But one, we already explained on our side of the house that the counterfactual is much worse. If they're actually defending the status quo where refugees are crammed in these really bad living conditions with no way to communicate with the outside and also viewed very badly by the domestic populace, then there is already no way to demand things in the status quo. A very easy way to demand things is, like we said in our first amendment point, abide by the framework that when you give to the state gives back to you, which means that namely under a loosely phrased social contract interpretation of how the states ought to work, or any states really, it means that individuals would or are more likely to give to refugees if refugees give back first. But the second argument here is just that even if it is true that we have an unconditional moral obligation, we work within pragmatic resource constraints to how that makes that work. In the status quo, countries don't want to take refugees at all. That's not just neighboring countries. For example, their mindset was probably correct in 2012 or 2013 when there weren't a lot of terror attacks, for example, or GDP wasn't declining in droves like we talked about in the OG, but rather right now in 2016, there actually is huge international sentiment against this. For example, look at what happened in Turkey literally at break night. The fact is that countries are not viewing refugees as some type of unconditional, costless moral obligation. That means there needs to be some sort of trade-off. But even if you don't believe that, we think that to spill over to Western countries or to have a more beneficial impact internationally, you need to have clear, transparent criteria for what actually is a condition on long-term refugee status. Right now in the status quo, there are basically lotteries, or there's some type of completely arbitrary or not understandable condition as to how you and your family can get into a country. On our side of the house, at least there are clear sets of expectations, not just in the short run in neighboring countries, but also in the long run in the international arena. I'll take closing.
Okay, so given that typical military training takes 1 to 3 years, how likely is it that these people are actually going to contribute to national security in any meaningful way?
That's another really useful piece of framing that came from the top of Justin's OG, which is that a lot of times these military roles do not necessarily need to be combat. It is completely unrealistic to say that most refugees who seek this type of help are the ones who are most capable, i.e. middle-aged adult or young men who are physically capable. More realistically, we can enlist them in services like translation help, or aid in social services to distribute resources among refugee camps, or other services that are not necessarily combat but still useful. This directly responds to their analysis, which is that they're likely to get translation in the military because one, there are no worse jobs in the military. Having the worst jobs in the military is still better than sitting in a refugee camp and not having opportunities at all. In which case, right now in the status quo, they not only not have employment, but they also have no ability to contribute otherwise to the state. But the second reason is just that even if it is true that they get the shittiest positions, at least in the long run, there are exit opportunities to get to better positions on on our side of the house. On their side of the house, they have no route to do that at all. Like we said in the OG, it is likely that there's some type of compensation or some type of income, at least in the short run, to help these families sustain not only themselves, but also help others around them. That means there are more proactive benefits on our side of the house. So what's their next argument? They say that people are more likely to be traumatized on our side of the house when we actually send them to the combat zones that have traumatized them initially. But one, this is just a description of war, right? Like, war is traumatizing to any individual regardless of identity status, but even if it is uniquely more traumatizing to these individuals, we argue that it is equally traumatizing already to have been pushed away from your home and literally have nothing that organizes the day-to-day scheduling or activity of your life. On their side of the house, they have no structure and no long-term hope for what refugees can look forward to. On our side of the house, we at least give some type of semblance of a meaningful path to citizenship looking forward, but not just that, but also something to occupy their days in their day-to-day life, because if you actually listen to the refugees that are speaking, for example, to news outlets or radio casts, what they're saying is that their biggest pain right now is the complete inability to do anything at all. That means the ability to do something or contribute something meaningfully to the conditions they live in is still more beneficial. A little bit rebuilding on our side of the house. Sit down. On their side, they say that we ultimately get more capacity from other states because the neighboring countries at hand get most funding from Western countries, for example, like Greece or the United States. But one, the argument is that aid right now is declining significantly, right? There's no domestic political will, not only in neighboring countries like I talked about earlier in the speech, but also Western countries, because it is incredibly unlikely that the massive populist movements that are winning over in Europe or the United States are going to look favorably at refugees no matter what. That means the question in this round is not how Western countries are going to allocate aid, because on both sides of the house, aid is going down. But at least on our side of the house, we have some type of resemblance of making up for that aid, because if they contribute to annual GDP, or they have more employment opportunities in the long term, if they learn valuable skills, for example, in the military that can spill over to the private sector in those economies, and that is at least a little bit better than what they had, which is a system of no alternatives, or at least a system that is very ill-defined, because all they say is state-based employment. Like, what does that actually mean outside some type of militaristic capacity if the biggest problem is conflict right now? But the second argument that they give is that no, ultimately it doesn't change the real problem, which is immediate intake. It only affects long-term trajectories or long-term impacts. But one, like, even if we're not alleviating the conflict right now, we agree that the conflict's not going to end anytime soon. And it's at least comparatively better that in the long run, when the conflict does end, because Western countries are still involved in some capacity, even if they're not giving aid, and that means that there's more integration in the future. The biggest problem we can have right now is the formation of ethnic enclaves, for instance, or very low socioeconomic status ghettos that do not actually get integrated into the broader economy as a whole 10 or 20 years down the road. Those impacts always outweigh the short-sighted, myopic moral obligations that they talk about, because there is no foresight into what their world looks like in the future. But the second reason as to why you prefer our world is because social integration can come from fighting. They say that fighting is just not beneficial whatsoever, but our argument is not just that fighting is the only path. The argument is that they are more likely to use their skills to create synergies for distributing aid in countries that are already short-staffed. For those reasons, I'm so proud to
Thanks, Pete, for those remarks. Hereby called on Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
The first thing I'm going to deal with in this speech is this: the false assertion that states near the conflict zone will take more refugees. By their own analysis, there is large amounts of animosity and fear that refugees will compromise the security of the state. So what better way to amplify that fear than take in thousands of people and give them military training? I'm sure domestic populations in Turkey and Lebanon will love that, knowing now they have 10,000 Syrian refugees in their armed corps. The second claim they make is, but this will be a really efficient use. Note how desperate at DPM they get defending this. They're like, but guys, there are non-combat roles. We can make them do social services. Let's cut the middleman and employ them in social services and not make them undergo military training. You can't defend that. Like, if you want the military to be healthcare, guys, allocate them to where you want. But What I'm going to do in this speech is firstly talk about why military training and 1 year of military training is almost certainly the worst solution, will incur more cost, will deter states from taking on refugees, and will push the West to blame Turkey and Lebanon for their refugee crisis. No, thank you. Secondly, I'm going to look at how this impacts refugee intake and also the treatment of refugees more broadly. I'll try to impose more structure as I go. Firstly, let's look at the military. What did they say? They said this is a good solution because it provides the benefit of job security and they will contribute now. This is the point in their case where they give you the least analysis. Consider the barriers to the efficacy of refugees that makes a short-termist mentality poor. They may not speak the language, they may be malnourished, they may have missed years of their education, they are likely to be suffering from short-term trauma and mental illness, and that side says the best way to eke out any benefit is to shove them into the military and hope it works. That's why a long-term mentality is the only sufficient or logical one, because you actually have to give them the training, and then if you believe and we think all citizens have a duty to contribute, but if you think they ought to contribute, they can only do so in the long run, and military training is bad. But beyond that, note that it's extremely inefficient allocation of human capital, right? Syria, before the conflict, was relatively middle class. This takes all the doctors, engineers, nurses, and social service people and allocates them to the military as though that was an effective use. And whilst they might be finicky that there are some number of non-combat roles, that clashes with their own material that these people will help benefit the resolution to the conflict, which suggests that they can only do so if they're on the front line. That side needs to engage with it. But note as well, right, the Jordan and Turkish military do not have particularly favourable views of women, certainly children, and those are the people likely to be locked out of such asylum seeker policies by side government. That side needs to engage with how this will be used to deny the most vulnerable people long-term care. The next thing they said is, but you also have costs, but now they won't help the conflict. Again, consider, yes, of course we have costs, but we can get much more of those. You are likely to reduce the incentive for states to take on additional refugees because, as I've just shown, military training as well is much more expensive than things like basic language training, basic housing, rather than providing them with a much higher wage that typically military training requires. And then, again, consider that these people will not be useful. Consider how they'll be used in this military. They're likely to not be very helpful or productive, which means, so thank you, that and often there's large amounts of animosity, which means we think states will push them into positions where they're at the most risk, where they're likely to be put on the front lines, just like ISIS used foreign recruits in a similar manner because they were not effective militarily. Consider what that side is saying. But equally, these people now have no lobbying power to fight against that once they're militarized, no thank you, rather than existing in the state. The second claim from DPM is, but we improve perception that they're a risk. I've dealt with this in my introduction. You absolutely don't, because you militarize them, which makes people deeply worried about the large numbers. No thank you. So, at the end of that point, military training and allocation is the worst way to use these people. It incurs greater costs that exist now. Why will this now diminish the amount of refugees that we take in? Two reasons here. Firstly, that we think the economic burdens don't change, no thank you, with 1 year of service compared to just taking in refugees, which means that this is likely to displace existing intakes rather than supplement those. And that's what we say here. Note the security concern and the populist movements they talk about is likely to act as a very good bulwark to taking in larger numbers of refugees than they might want. But the comparative here is important. Because under their side, they remove the impetus for the West to solve or help this refugee crisis, right? Germany has taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees. Canada, UK, US, and a little bit Australia, but not really because we suck, are trying to take in as much as possible. And this deals with the CGPOI. They say no one's taking in refugees. That's a lie, right? Jordan's taking in hundreds of thousands as well. But you reduce the impetus for the West because now the West can say, that's your problem. You should have put them into military training, and they can shift their burden in a way that diminishes the efficacy of existing movements. Obviously, the refugee crisis under either side, no thank you, is unideal. But that side absolutely makes it worse. Let's look now, and I take you now.
Great. So on your side of the house, refugees can't get anything resembling a job and live in close, cramped quarters where there's no check on rampant human rights abuses that hurt the people that you identify to be most vulnerable. Why is it that you make it better in concrete policy?
Okay, to be clear, so do you, because you still have very large numbers of refugees in short-term situations. They're not in long-term. Secondly, if you believe, panel, that the government has the means to militarily train and give all refugees jobs, then that government also has the ability to give them different jobs that are more efficiently aligned with the skills and abilities that they have, but also have a much more and effective longer-term perspective that is likely to be much more net economically contributive, much more restorative of any GDP loss, and a much greater incentive to take refugees than under your side. Deal with the reality here, guys. You just can't assert that we can't do anything. Lastly, let's look at impact. They said there's less infrastructure for integration. The only infrastructure is military integration. That ignores the enormous amount of investment from the West in areas like Jordan and Lebanon, alongside existing domestic efforts. They say, we provide them with job security. Extremely assertive. We know that 1 year of military training is a very poor method to integrate them into society. It's very ill-equipped for the day-to-day domestic economy that you'd like them to integrate in. Far more effective is just to try to integrate them into the economy in the first place, rather than send them into a war zone, re-traumatize them, and then say, now you're on your own, good luck. We'd note as well, like, American Army vets don't have a particularly good job security rate. That side needs to explain why. They say they will contribute now. I've dealt with this conclusively. They absolutely won't. Finally, on the right to asylum, they say they receive benefits they should have to pay back. Note just how contingent the case from opening government and the government bench is. They need to prove that that benefit will be extracted. We've conclusively shown you it won't. If you believe that duty exists, you can maximise it and maximise the ability for it to exist on our side. But we say that here you reduce the burden that should be borne by others, by the West that fueled and started the proxy war in Syria, by states that owe more to the most vulnerable. For those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Those remarks, hereby call upon the Member of Government.
My first point of extension will prove the following: that this policy creates militaries that are sympathetic to the plights of refugees and to increasing refugee intakes in those countries, and why that's the only way to get benefits for those refugees. Because opening opposition had a remarkably uncontextual case. Most Gulf states that surround crises in Syria already don't take any refugees at all. Countries that do right now, such as Jordan, are right now working on policies to block more refugees from coming or to deport them from where they came back from. And opening opposition's only response to this was to say, well, rich countries still feel a sense of responsibility, and poor countries can ask those rich countries for money. Obviously, very, very rapidly becoming increasingly totally untrue. Merkel just had the worst election of her career. She has caved to the Islamophobic rhetoric and said she would ban the burqa and similar type statements, caving to the exact sentiments that lead to people not wanting those refugees in the first place. That's why you can't just rely upon the West having a increasingly non-existent feeling of responsibility. And you also can't just instead give them cushy jobs in healthcare in those countries that the people within those countries themselves probably usually can't get. Opening opposition could absolutely not claim those best case benefits. So, what is the choice therefore on our side of the house? We think that militaries have the capacity to influence both the public opinions of governments in many of these countries. They're very prestigious in general, and specifically in places near conflict zones, people expect a lot of them and rely on them a lot, right? Because, if there's a conflict on your border, that military better be pretty damn good, so you care a lot about the people who run them, and often they are actually politically significant. What does taking a lot of refugees and putting them into military ranks do to the incentives of those militaries, and how they have their capacity to wield that totally immense power to influence governments? Number one, and this responds to one of James Leeder's pushes in his speech, because he said, well, now all of Lebanon and Turkey is going to be like, oh shit, there are 10,000 refugees in our militaries and they're going to feel really panicked. But obviously, militaries are not going to be that keen on people having that perception. Militaries want to stay powerful, they want to have funding continue to be sourced to them, and therefore they have really powerful incentives to continue to portray themselves as having integrity. They don't want the people's faith in them to be shaken. They want to have their connections to government and their funding to remain existent. So that means it's incredibly likely that militaries in our world will push as hard as they can to defend how good the refugees in their ranks are, to tell people about how trustworthy they are, how good they are at fighting, to give examples of when refugees made sacrifices or did very honourable things. All of those mean that the biggest messaging mechanism that anyone in this team can rely on falls to closing government, and that leads to the better perception of refugees that everybody wants on both sides of the house. Secondly, militaries will want to push for more refugees in general because they want more people to be able to use, as our opening said, often they lack refugees. To respond to the thing about what can you do with them for a year, well, presumably militaries will want those, if that is true, presumably militaries will want those refugees to stay for longer. They'll try to give them good conditions and stuff like that after the 1 year of compulsory service and try to make them remain in that job. And that means, again, that those militaries will try to argue their governments in a case where governments are vanishingly unwilling to be able to do this, to take in more refugees that claims that benefit. Third reason why militaries are likely to do this, because refugees are likely to have more of a voice in those militaries than they did before. And opening opposition tried to rubbish this point preemptively by saying, these are the most vulnerable people, and the militaries will just be like, fuck you, down to you are bottom feeders now, there's no hope for you. But I reckon that militaries have active incentives to prevent that kind of culture from happening with them. Militaries want to foster trust between those people. They don't want 10,000 angry people who hate the institution they're forced to be in to exist within those ranks. Therefore, they have incentives to force people to bond. And in fact, warfare in general and being in kinds of difficult situations in general intrinsically tends to bond people. For example, in stressful partial double octos in Worlds outrounds. That is again more likely that people will break the gaps that they have between refugees. Different soldiers will come to perceive those refugees better, and all of those again lead to better perceptions rippling out into the wider world. The opening half could not just rely on how governments would perceive it. They needed a specific mechanism for how you change people's minds and how you actually influence government decisions. Militaries were significant organs that had the capacity to do that. That is why we win the point about which country gets more people and turns away less people from hellscapes. That's why we're happy to propose initially. But I have a second point of extension, but I'll first take it.
Your extension relies on the countries you say take currently close to 0 refugees, taking in refugees on the basis of a single year of service, and installing enough of them, and then being perceived as valuable despite being forced into it, they would influence that large military. How does that happen?
Wait, why does it rely on that at all? Presumably the country, it happens in both cases. So the countries that currently currently do take refugees but could take a lot more will now have those refugees in military service, at which point all of those incentives apply. So actually, no, we're talking about the exact stakeholder that you're talking about, except we win it, unlike you. So, secondly, why does this improve those countries' capacities to fight conflicts? We think, firstly, nations that border in conflict zones have structurally good incentives with those wars, have structurally want good things rather than bad things in general. Though we concede that in some cases Turkey might also have incentives to fight the Kurds and stuff like that, overall they're good. That is because those countries have incentives to pursue the long-term stability of those regions, and therefore will concentrate on the most viciously destabilizing of those elements, like ISIS. And they also tend not to want to fight against the most sympathetic actors. So that is why Turkey is incredibly tentative when they're fighting against the Kurds, because they know that the international community as a general thinks the Kurds are great and don't want to face sanctions. So that's why they have good incentives. Refugees have enormous capacities to help them fight those wars. And this also responds to opening opposition saying they'll treat those refugees badly. If we prove that governments actually can use refugees strategically in ways that are very beneficial, countries will do that rather than just killing them or throwing them onto the beaches of Versailles. Wait, what's that beach where everyone died on Deer? That is because refugees are the ones who are the most sympathetic to the hearts and minds of the people in those countries. And hearts and minds are exactly what those armies want to win, and what winning those wars is contingent on. So they're likely to use these refugees to try to win over those people, and that is an incredible benefit for our side of the house. I'm happy to
And speak for those remarks, call upon the member of opposition. Here.
LSE! 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 LSE!
the current state of affairs, we treat refugees pretty horribly, to be honest. But somehow when they move into the army, one of the most compassionate units of the entire government, suddenly they're going to be treated like these heroes and they're going to have a voice again. We don't think that's going to be the case. First thing we want to point out in terms of rebuttal towards the extension is, do these militaries really want refugees in the military? We don't think that's the case for a few reasons. See, they presume the military will treat them in the most ideal way and give them the most voice. We don't think that's going to happen. First reason, bear in mind, opening government said they're going to put these individuals mainly in non-combat jobs. These are known within the military as the cushy jobs that everyone wants. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a situation where all the soldiers who are going out there and dying on the front lines tell people, look at these refugees taking up all these support jobs that I would much rather be in. This is where you get animosity and hatred by the very way opening government has chosen to structure the roles of these refugees. But second of all, will they actually have a voice in this army? Realize that in a normal standard military, it is meant to break you down and destroy your individuality. I know, I went there before, I've spent a year there, it's horrible. What happens is with the refugees, more so than not, what is going to happen is because you don't want their voice to grow too strong, for them to influence this insider culture within the army, for them to usurp your voice, what you're going to do is you're going to suppress them even more. You're going to further break them down, make them, separate them to units, and that kind of thing. No thank you. But third of all, so therefore what we're going to see is they can't collectivize, you're not going to have the voice you see, but you also have an incentive to treat you badly, because you don't want them to disrupt your insider culture, which is the third response over here. We think in militaries, very often they collectivize themselves around a common identity, usually nationality or ethnicity. For example, in the Turkish army, you try to exclude the Kurds as much as possible. And now, if you're a Kurd in Syria running to the nearest country possible, which is like Turkey, you're probably not going to be treated very well in the army there, given there's the same army that kills your people in your homeland. So in these armies, you see a very insider culture. And people want to make sure that people on the outside don't break into their bubble in the army. There's usually a very politicization of the army. There's usually a chain of command and individuals that form a tight-knit circle of insiders. And what happens is you don't want them to disrupt it, therefore you would make sure they can't come inside, you'll suppress them furthermore. Moving on to extension, we think that we're going to take a very selfish framework in this debate. No thank you. We're going to talk about why it's bad for the army and bad for integration. So the framework we want to analyze this with is, are these refugees best placed contributing via the army or contributing via the economy? Bear in mind, opening government said that they're not getting jobs in the status quo, they're just languishing in refugee camps, but somehow you're going to have perfect integration to the army. We would say, we're going to use all the resources you use to integrate into the army, and for one short year, and instead place them better in the economy. Assuming you get integration, we think we can place that integration just as well. And this integration will be long-term because you're going to spend your life in the economy, not in the army. You're better off in the economy, integrating that from the start.
On a point of
First area of argument, but first, yeah, closing.
Do you think it takes more political capital to conscript someone for 1 year into the military, or to pay for a year of training for them to become a long-term functioner of the economy?
Well, the first thing is you don't really need to pay for them to be trained because most people already have skills that allow them to function in the economy. You have to pay a lot more to train them in the army, but also there's a perception that you're leeching off because you're taking the wages of fellow soldiers in that army. You're taking the training, you're displacing other soldiers, and you're taking all the cushy jobs that other soldiers could otherwise in your army be taking as well. First of all, why is this bad for army cohesion? Let's recognize in armies, particularly near conflict zones, are usually collect around a common identity, which is nationality or ethnic identity. They do so because they require trust to function. We're not saying that these refugees are untrustworthy. We think there's a nuanced argument here, which is they're perceived to be untrustworthy, usually because they come from conflict zones, conflict regions, which the other country is also involved in. Like, for example, Turkey and the Kurds, or Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire. So the problems we see here is, first of all, you're going to see less cohesion during combat. Because you don't speak the same language, you don't share the same cultural practices, you may not even share the same support for the army's missions. If you're a Kurd in the Turkish army seeking that long-term refuge, you are not going to like the Turkish army altogether. If you're a person running to Nigeria from the Central African Republic, you have no stake in the Nigerian war efforts at all. So what's going to happen is you're going to see mutual distrust between those who are the refugees and those who are already in the army. This means you get a less functional army. You get less trust in the tight-knit conflict situations. You're less likely to be able to support each other and have a functioning, cohesive unit. But we also see this in non-combat roles as well, if you want to play it soft. So This is situations where you don't trust the translator, where you don't trust the person serving you food, or you rather find another doctor because you don't think that refugee doctor is going to help you particularly either. This all in turn functions to make the army less cohesive. So the overarching problem here and the comparison is on your side, you spend taxpayers' money to train, feed, pay, and give shelter to soldiers who don't want to be trained by you, don't want to be fed by you, or don't even want to be sheltered to you. And in turn, you get a less functional army that in many cases doesn't want you to come inside and disrupt its way it works currently. So we rather integrate into the economy immediately and be able to contribute and not leech off taxpayers' money if you want to work within a self-interested framework in this debate.
On that.
Sure, opening.
Great. So in the economy, one job going to refugee takes away one job from a domestic citizen, which decreases public support. How, in your side of the house, do you increase public sentiment if the military is the only branch that can fiat the creation of meaningful jobs?
That's not really the case. We think refugees and domestic citizens have different functions of jobs. We'll go there in the third public section. But second of all, we think what happens in these armies is you create ethnic pockets. Because what happens is you can't just shove refugees into this army and expect integration. Instead, what happens, you see enclaves within the armies. And this is even worse, because if soldiers see those enclaves every day, if you see them collecting around the fire camp without the rest of the soldiers, that's a division they see everywhere. It further otherizes the refugees. You don't get the integration, you also see them as a leech in the army. On our hand, you see when they integrate into the economy, what happens, you see them offering you services. You see them doing things for you. And that normalizes them even more so than when you see them dividing within the army. Third part of this extension, why do you think these refugees are better placed in the economy? Realize that yes, it might be difficult to get them integrated in the economy. It's also equally difficult to get them integrated in the army. Both are equal. But the thing is, these refugees usually have unique positions in the economy. They usually have links to their home countries. They usually bring in hard currency via the exports to their home countries. They also help organize imports from their home countries. Even though these countries may be war-torn, they still have functional economies. And they provide those links between those countries. But second of all, they usually have niche skills that people in the home country don't have. And they also have they're able to faster integrate into business because we give them 1 year. So in the end, these citizens, these refugees are best placed in the economy where they can serve a niche, individualized role. Rather in the army, where they push out and displace soldiers from those cushy jobs, where they are not trusted, where they form enclaves in this army are even otherized even further. We're very proud to oppose.
Let's thank the Speaker for those remarks and call upon the Government Whip to close the case for the Gov bench.
At the centre of this debate is the question of how militaries are likely to react to this policy. It was the insight of the closing government that militaries are capable of influencing politics, that they have authority under the policy that we propose to choose how they treat refugees, whether they treat them well or treat them poorly. And that's significant in this debate because it means that all of the questions that we wanted to ask, how do we change the body politic to make it more conducive to accepting refugees, how do we best respond to the crisis that those particular individuals are facing, are in a large part influenced by that particular actor. So the first thing that I want to talk about, which broadly I think resolves the clash in the closing half, is this question of whether or not militaries will react poorly or well. So what jobs will refugees most likely possess in the military? So I think it's like an example of what I think is a sort of a habit of selective characterization from the member of the opposition, which is highly selective characterization of what those jobs are going to look like. Just because a job is not directly on the front lines does not mean that it is a cushy support job that everyone desperately wants. What the military is an incredibly complex logistical organization that has to move across enormous territories of land, that has to establish facilities, that needs to continue to provide services to people when they're outside of those traditional structures, as they might be back at home. And that means that there are a lot of incredibly difficult jobs that require a huge amount of manpower. You need to do things like you need to dig trenches, you need to be able to drive vehicles, you need to be able to move things across vast areas, you need to be able to set up particular structures that the military can use. Those are all jobs that are very, very unpleasant, that often involve manual labour, that often occur far away from people's home communities where they might be more comfortable. And that importantly means that there's something very valuable for those refugees to do, and also something that people from that home country that probably have a wider array of options available to them are not likely to do themselves. The significance of that is that it demonstrates that militaries do have sharp incentives to ensure that refugees are able to provide that role within their militaries. And that's why the incentives that we describe in our extension about how militaries are likely to, as a consequence of this policy, support continued inflows of refugees that allow them to perform those functions more effectively are likely to occur. Closing governments then wants to tell us that the problem is that militaries are racist. So this might be true to an extent, but let's remember that all institutions of society and the economy are racist. So that's the first response. The second thing to note here is that the question of how individual foot soldiers within the military might react with each other in the context of, say, a training program doesn't affect the strategic thinking of the top brass, which is the way in which our extension works and how they're likely to respond. But the final thing that I want to claim here is that in a wide variety of ways, the military is far less likely to be racist than comparable institutions, not the weirdly utopian, perfectly racially integrated economy that was described in the member of the opposition speech. So let's talk through a few of those. The first is that, as is described in the member of the opposition's own speech, the military has a culture of low individuality. They try and remove the sense in which you're a single autonomous person and instead say you operate as part of a collective. And that means that your loyalty lies not to your particular culture or your particular prejudices in response to someone, but rather as part of a collective whole. That's the set of cultural norms that the military tries to instantiate in everyone that participates in it, and that creates a framework that makes it unusually unlikely to engage in things that victimize the most vulnerable people. And what that demonstrates is that militaries. So the final thing to say here is that militaries also engage in counterinsurgency operations in a very large number of cases, and that requires them to be very, very good at responding to the needs of local populations and being sensitive to how to avoid offending those populations. So that means that armies have both the capacities in terms of the way they discipline their soldiers and also strong incentives to ensure they are being responsive to the needs of those refugees and to ensure they're not being racially exclusionary. Let's contrast that to other aspects of the economy where none of those incentives exist. I think that it was a fantasy for closing off to claim that if you're working a shitty service job in a rundown neighborhood in Ankara, that's going to be some paragon of racial integration. All right, let's now move on to whether or not countries are more likely to take refugees. Okay.
We told you these refugees are traumatized and coerced, often don't speak the language, and won't be productive in the short term. How does being in the military give them a voice when it stokes the fears that domestic populace and military say already dislikes them?
So this is the response your closing gave as well. Our extension is not about refugees being powerful within the military. It's about people that are already powerful in the military having incentives that align with the interests of refugees. So that's not actually a response to the mechanism that we provided you, and your operator will have to come up with a different one. All right. What encourages people to take refugees? Our opening provided generic material about why refugees are more likely to appear sympathetic. We provided you with a far more detailed characterization about exactly who makes them seem more sympathetic and why they're likely to be effective. And that's what closing government is able to offer in a far more powerful way about why countries are likely to be more responsive to the needs of refugees. We explained that there's a significant imperative here to the extent that many countries are either not responding to the needs of refugees at all, or they're doing so in an incredibly temporary way, like the governments of Jordan and Turkey are. So Emma, in her speech, says that there's currently a perception that there's an unconditional obligation to refugees, and that is likely to erode. I think that this is simply the status quo, that there is already an increasing sense around the world that refugees are a security threat, and we don't have any obligation to deal with that as a consequence of the fact that refugees aren't getting back to the economy. I don't think the opposition did almost anything in this debate to prove that their unconditional obligation narrative actually existed or was likely to be strong in the absence of our policy. The next thing that opening opposition says in the deputy speech, in James's speech, is that people will be more frightened of refugees if they've been in the military. I think this is wildly implausible. The military is likely to in very explicit ways, guarantee the loyalty of refugees, to say that they participated as foot soldiers, as part of our organisation, they were willing to express loyalty to a greater whole, and that's why we ought to continue to take those refugees. Indeed, our extension explains why this is incorrect, that it flies in the face of how the military is actually likely to betray those things. And what we would say is that the military is likely to do things like feature refugees in military parades, like when there are memorial services to explicitly mention the important contribution of refugees, which is likely to have a profound and transformative effect on how they're perceived in the body politic. Closing government says So closing government, I'll just return quickly to this material about how the army is racist. Economies are incredibly racist as well. They're geographically segregated, they're often highly hierarchical, with dominant ethnic groups at the top of that economic hierarchy and refugees and people from excluded ethnic groups at the bottom of that hierarchy. That's the actual counterfactual, highly disintegrated, hierarchical and exclusionary economies that the closing opposition has to wear in this debate. I think that they needed to do far more to explain why the counterfactual of what refugees are likely to be doing that isn't the army is better. They weren't able to do that, and that's why closing government is ahead of this debate.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. Call upon the opposition whip to close the case for the op bench and the debate as a whole.
LSE! 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 Woo!
OG rested their hat on the idea that this motion better integrates the refugees. Closing government put their hat on the fact that more refugees are going to be in this country. I'm going to knock both their hats down. I'm going to tell you why this doesn't happen. I'm then going to go on and tell you why this compromises military cohesion and basically explain why this screws over the countries more so than ever. I'm going to deal with that kind of in that term. So firstly, dealing with integration. Because OG tell us this is the route to society. The military is the great leader for these immigrants. And like, we get told there's currently no mechanism for integration, and therefore the solution is to establish a terrible one, right? So military is a terrible impression of society. It gets very few real-world skills. It teaches you often how to shoot guns or to ride a jeep. We don't think these are the things that help these people. We think especially when we're considering people that already literally have skills, we're already part of an economy, and then you're telling us that they need these things to help them better integrate. We just don't buy that's true. We think, on the other hand, we think that they do have things like very high levels of sexual assault and discrimination. We think that we then get told from closing government that these things happen in all parts of society, and actually militaries teach you to be as one. Tell that to the black American soldiers who face 5 times as many cases of racial discrimination and assault as average citizens. Tell that to the women in the military who face 10 times as high rates of sexual assault. We just don't buy that the military is this nice fluffy place where these people are going to have a nice time. The end result is an opportunity foregone. I think that's important to consider. The first impression of society, your first way in which you integrate into a group is incredibly important. We think this is a long-term harm. We're not just losing a year that these people could do things. We're specifically harming them, specifically making them worse actors in the long run. Let's put you into the mind of giving someone a basic subsistence living is the same as training them to be effective in the military, or you don't train them and they're terrible and they don't do any good. There's also massive loss of economic output. These people have skills. They have a large opportunity to produce. This requires real societal integration and actually getting them jobs and getting them homes. We think that doesn't happen at the moment where you're spending far more money getting them into the military and then presumably chucking them out afterwards into the real world and say, there you go, chum, hope you had a fun time. Anti-refugee impressions are exacerbated because we get this idea that they don't contribute. Now they literally don't, right? Now it's no longer this evil rhetoric spread by people like Trump and Farage. It's literally they are not helping the economy. We think that's even worse. Right, now moving on to increasing refugee numbers. First, I'll take opening.
Great. So what we see in the closing debate is that different militaries with different cultures and different contracts treat people differently. How do you change the broader perception of the general public if in your status quo or in your world they're not contributing at all?
Okay. We don't have to propose that we do what we do right now. We think what we do right now is quite bad. As I said earlier, we don't think the solution to this is to do something even worse, right? We think the solution to it is solve the problem and to encourage people to like refugees. Doesn't happen under your side. Now increasing refugee numbers. This is closing this kind of case. Loads of analysis on why militaries matter. Society listens to them. We absolutely agree with this, right? This is all true. Then we get told, they're going to love these soldiers so much because they help them win wars. They're going to be fantastic and helpful. They're going to love them. This is where we disagree. Big point of contention here. Because opening and closing both agree these are all going to be non-combatant roles. They are going to be the kind of things we've got nice descriptions already. Why the hell would I be okay with this if I'm a soldier, right? Why the hell would I be okay with them taking these kind of roles that don't involve the risk of life? Because already they're probably fighting in wars that they believe were already caused by these refugees and caused by their culture. I'm probably going to be pretty pissed about that. And I'm already probably not going to be okay with this. We then get told by WIP that manual labour's really hard because you have to lift stuff. Probably fair, right? Not as bad as getting shot and killed. These are just not comparable things. We think it's likely this is how the soldiers are going to see these things. Now let's look at like the higher ups, the army chiefs, because I think they're going to be even more pissed, because they have to invest huge costs into training these people, dealing with all their social problems, dealing with the fact they're not very effective soldiers, for 1 year of service in which they like bugger off back into society. Like, we don't think they're going to be particularly happy, especially when we consider the fact that the kind of people they actually want are combatants. They want people to fight these wars. They want people they can give guns and go kill people, not people who can like cook or translate or whatever the hell they're going to say. We then get like told into a response to a BOI like it's not about them actually being good, right? It's just about making them seem good. We think these things are kind of in contention because we think the army, like higher ups of the military, are probably going to go, actually they're not contributing. We don't think we should have more of them. Get the hell rid of these refugees who are just clogging up our armies. Finally, yeah, this idea of voice in the military. Like, we're not sure if opposing government are aware, but there is a hierarchy in the military, right? Which means I don't buy that the ground soldiers are suddenly going to have a massive voice, especially when we consider like the monarchy of Jordan. We think it's unlikely that the king is going to go and listen, like, and spend a day listening to his grunts say about how much fun they're having with their new chums. We just don't buy that that is a realistic scenario. We think we're unlikely to have more increased, like, the military is going to produce these, like, increased demand for refugees. Finally, costs to the military, and this is what we bring you in closing. Because in OG they try to claim that there are benefits to national security. There's already this given here. The issue is there is unlikely to be any benefit. Why? Because these people are terrible, terrible soldiers. They are terrible, terrible people to put in these situations. They tend to be elderly, they tend to be women, they tend to be children. They are avoiding conflict, they have vested interests. Kurdish soldiers we think that because of these vested interests, they're probably unlikely to want to contribute, as Adam was explaining. Like, if I'm a Kurdish refugee who's moving to Turkey, I'm not happy to be happy serving in their military. I'm happy to do a lot. We asked this in the POI. Again, we get this idea of non-combatants. One, we think they still need training and takes time. But secondly, why the hell would the general populace accept this? Of course they will want to make them fight. We think they're quite likely to be forced to fight, especially in situations where there is a lot of pressure on national security. We think it's quite likely they'll end up having to be put into combat roles in many circumstances. There's also, again, this huge cost, but one fundamentally, I've explained this already, they break up unit cohesion. Cooperation is unlikely to happen when people view them as directly responsible for the conflicts that they're happening. Why is this so harmful? I don't think it takes a ton of analysis for me to explain why countries on the border of conflicts are quite likely to be near conflicts, right? We think that military cohesion is vital at a point where national security is compromised. We think that we're more likely to have terrible militaries that can't fight people like ISIS. This is a real harm that breaks things down. Government painted this as a free choice. We don't cost us nothing. We think this ignores all the costs we pointed out. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our for the speech. We have one round of applause for all of the teams. If you could just hold